Hi, my name is Claudia Fotiu, and this is my psychological factors presentation for KIN 552. The title of my presentation is Incidence of Burnout in Youth Soccer. So we'll go ahead and get started. Let's see here, I think I can go to the next slide. Okay, there we go. So the contents, let's see, I'm going to have to move myself around here a little bit. The contents are going to include target population and rationale for selection. It's going to include some research as well. I'll go ahead and discuss intrinsic and extrinsic factors, psychological hindrances that may affect performance and overall well-being within sports participation. I'll also provide a mission statement and then what I've learned in the course so far. So we'll get started. All right, so the target population that I've selected, let's see, I'm going to be moving myself around here. The target population that I've selected is organized youth soccer. So essentially anyone under the age of 18 years old. So that can include young athletes participating at their local schools. So here in California, those would be athletes under the governing body of CIF, the California Interscholastic Federation. We also have private club leagues, American Youth Soccer Organization, which is AYSO, and then also elite academies. So it's going to be kind of all-encompassing, but the biggest focus, the primary focus, is athletes under the age of 18. Population selection rationale. So for myself personally, as a head athletic trainer at the secondary school level, I find that this is very, very relevant as it largely has to do with my patient population, which is athletes under the age of 18. Also, one thing I've noticed that I've taken a particular interest in this is due to the incidence of injury, I've taken a particular interest in soccer. I have noticed we have athletes that compete in club as well as soccer for the high school. And I have noticed that there is an increased incidence of injury over time. I've noticed kind of an upward trend with injury patterns that come walking through my clinic. And typically the first question I ask them is, do you play club soccer as well? And almost without fail, it's like, yeah, I play club soccer too. So that's one of the reasons I took a particular interest in it. Also, partiality and personal experience. I used to play soccer. Soccer is my favorite sport, so this is a population that I was really eager to study and get to know more about. All right, so what is burnout? So Davis et al. In 2019 characterizes burnout as essentially a syndrome that's going to be associated with both psychological and physical factors, which ultimately will lead to that kind of psychological and physical exhaustion, which will eventually start to see complete cessation of activity or participation within a certain sport. So I should say more specifically, what is athlete burnout? So the syndrome and the definition provided is essentially going to be specific to athletes. We're talking about athlete burnout and how this affects them overall. All right, so some research I researched a bunch of articles, but the ones I really want to focus and I want to highlight are the following ones that I'll go ahead and introduce. This was an article published by Davis, Stenling, Gustafson, Appleby, and Davis, 2019. And they wanted to look at things that could mitigate the incidence of athlete burnout. And so it consisted of 210 subjects that were participating in a multitude of competitive sports. It wasn't exclusively soccer. And what they went ahead and did is they administered a multi-section questionnaire, and that included demographic and background inventory on these athletes. And a very common trend you'll see throughout the following research articles that I discuss is the coach-athlete relationship quality questionnaire, as well as the athlete burnout questionnaire. These tools were commonly used across multiple studies that I investigated. And so what they found out, let's see, I'll kind of move myself out of the way here. Let's see, so you can get a better view. Well, trapping myself here in the corner. What they found out is that the athletes that were competing at higher levels reported less incidence of feeling less accomplished, essentially. So athletes that felt that were competing at a higher level kind of felt more accomplishment. Compared to athletes that were at a less competitive level, they kind of experienced a reduced sense of accomplishment based on their level of competition. Additionally, it was identified that team athletes tend to report higher incidence of burnout than solo athletes. That could also have to do with psychological factors or psychosocial factors, including team cohesion. Also, there's probably a more competitive nature that's associated with that can lead to that sense of that exhaustion in that team sport dynamic. It also noted that male athletes experience greater dependence on athlete-coach relationships with regards to their sense of accomplishment. So if they perceived their relationship with their coaches to be less than ideal, they noted that oftentimes these athletes kind of felt less accomplished. And this is again, we're talking about younger athletes here. So when you start to get into intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation, a lot of these athletes, they're developing their emotional intelligence, and most of their motivation, typically with younger athletes, is going to come from external factors or psychosocial factors like parental support, social support, rather than that intrinsic motivation. Younger athletes were more susceptible to feeling a lack of accomplishment if they didn't associate a strong or positive relationship with their coach again. So we also had gender associations with a sense of accomplishment as well as age, so age dependence. Another article here talked about developmental considerations. So when we are dealing with the special populations, when we look at pediatric populations or geriatric populations, those are considered special populations typically. And so Harris and Watson 2014, they went ahead and they examined the developmental considerations with respect to burnout with younger athletes. And it consisted of 181 participants and that were participating in youth club programs. And in similar fashion to the other study and the following studies I'll mention, is they used a multitude of questionnaires to kind of obtain their data. And so they had one custom questionnaire that assessed the athlete's individual sense of accomplishment, perception of physical and emotional exhaustion, and as well as sports evaluation, so how they felt in their sport and their disposition towards their sport. They also include the sport motivation scale, which looked at intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, or amotivation. So they're looking at kind of these developmental considerations and dispositions. As well as athletic identity, or athlete identity, I should say. So that was their own personal perception of competence, their enjoyment in the sport, and also social constraints that accompany that sport, which again can have to do with, back to that upper portion of the bullet point, sports devaluation. There's kind of a cost, a social cost that is involved when you have athletes participating at higher levels of competition, especially at that younger age where they're much more vulnerable. So with that study, they were able to identify a few things. They were able to identify that age was a correlate for incidence of burnout, finding that high school age athletes or athletes that were older had a higher incidence of burnout as opposed to adolescents or athletes that were younger. Also, length of sports participation. They also looked at how long an athlete was participating in that sport, but not only the length of participation, but also their level of performance. Not only performance, but also were they advancing? Was that athlete stagnating, or was there performance advancement, either that they had perceived or that they had seen? So, for example, athletes that kind of play that left bench position versus being first team, they kind of looked at the level of performance advancements that an athlete experienced too, and we're able to identify a correlate between level of performance advancement and incidence of burnout. And of course, at the end of the day, it's level of enjoyment, which again takes you back to that age correlate. Level of enjoyment. They found athletes that were younger had a much more greater sense of fulfillment and just pure enjoyment, where with the high school athletes, they were less likely to necessarily report that with the frequency that younger athletes or adolescents reported. And of course, all of these studies, they obtained consent from parents for all minors that were involved in the studies. Another one by Smith, Hill, and Hall, 2018. It was a research study that examined the personal disposition of these athletes. So we're talking more, this is kind of a nurture versus nature. They're looking at more of the nature side of things, an athlete's personal disposition and their tendencies towards perfectionism. And again, we're dealing with a younger population, so external factors can affect intrinsic factors, then they're much more vulnerable to that. So this was a longitudinal study of youth soccer athletes. So again, it was kind of difficult to find something focused on just youth soccer. A lot of the athlete burnout or incidences of athlete burnout, they did multi-sport studies. But this one was specific to youth soccer athletes. And again, they examined athlete disposition by obtaining an athlete profile and doing a personal interview, which included a questionnaire. And once again, those questionnaires involved a multidimensional perfectionism scale, as well as that commonly seen athlete burnout scale that we've seen in previous studies mentioned. And so with that, they found out that in these highly, highly competitive environments, specifically those club programs or those academies, there's a really, really high sense of competition. There's a lot of peer pressure, and that stress is induced by the competitive environment, but also by the stress induced by their peers. It's kind of a reward-based system that's based on exemplary performance, and it's a exemplary performance-based value system, essentially. Also, their personal sense of accomplishment. Again, their development of emotional intelligence. So again, we're kind of looking at age as well. And like I mentioned, competence-based value system. It goes back to that exemplary performance is required. There's a lot of pressure. And so with that, they look to see tendencies towards sustainable adaptations, and that's where the personality comes into play. They found that self-oriented perfectionism may be the most appropriate for that kind of dynamic, that type of environment, or an environment that is very, very highly competitive. And so they kind of looked at those types of adaptations and looked to see who was more likely to kind of adopt that kind of disposition of perfectionism in order to sustain themselves in that highly competitive environment. Factors affecting health and performance here. Let me move my picture. It's going to be physical, psychological, and psychosocial. These are the factors, essentially. These are the global terms, and we'll focus in on those. So we'll start with physical. One of the physical factors involved, DiFiore et al., 2014, highlights traumatic and chronic injury. Myself as a clinician, as an athletic trainer, I would also attest to this. Traumatic injuries, chronic injuries, it's really important as a clinician to take into account the psychology of an injury. Usually we deal with objective things. We're looking at things that we can see or palpate or appreciate via tactile response. But there is a psychological aspect to physical injury. Also delayed recovery. You know, these athletes, they travel, they don't oftentimes have appropriate periods of time in which they can recover. More and more I've noticed, especially with regards to the physical factor, the model of youth sports and recreational sports is abandoning its roots, and it's tending more towards a professional model where we start to see these injury patterns that are happening to young athletes that you typically don't see, that we typically didn't see beforehand, that we're now seeing more and more often in younger athletes that we usually only see in professional level athletes or highly competitive adult athletes. And also physical exhaustion. That's what Harrison Watson had previously mentioned, physical exhaustion as well. To move on to the psychological factor, again, intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation is what our text refers. But also, one thing I want to touch on is when we are dealing with younger athletes, a lot of times, and I'll continue with this, one of the biggest identifiers they noted was the increased vulnerability, and that these athletes didn't necessarily have hadn't really developed their intrinsic motivation yet. They were highly dependent on the motivation of their social support system. General disposition, personality, we talked about that, nurture versus nature. Some athletes are maybe at an increased incidence of burnout based on their disposition. Also perfectionism, that's going to start to kind of make its way into the psychological aspects or psychological strain for athletes. Stress, of course. Competence perception seemed to be a main theme across multiple studies that I examined, was competence perception, and of course developmental age, and that's what Harrison Watson had mentioned with regards to the incidence of burnout with high school age athletes being more increased as opposed to adolescents. And psychosocial, incredibly important, as again, the questionnaires implemented and employed by all these studies, they use that athlete-coach relationship questionnaire. So the relationship between athletes and coaches, if it's a positive one or a negative one. Once again, dependence on approval from adult figures. These are younger athletes. That intrinsic motivation is still developing. They're still heavily dependent and vulnerable to criticism and support or lack thereof to adult figures around them. For example, their parents or coaching staff. Team dynamic and cohesion is certainly incredibly important when you're dealing with team sports. And then interpersonal competition. That last study previously mentioned about disposition, nurture versus nature. There are going to be some dispositions that are more viable in a very highly competitive environment versus others that might not benefit very well personally or psychologically from a social environment that is incredibly competitive. Barriers to growth. I'll go ahead and I'll stop here and I'll go ahead and start with the next part.